Hi everyone, my name is Alan Davis, founder of mediatoracademy.com, home of the passionate and hungry mediator. This is the place where mediators, aspiring, new and accomplished, come and learn from experienced mediators, practitioners and thought leaders from around the world. The people we interview are incredibly generous with their time. They share their knowledge and experience with you so that you can learn, you can grow, you can improve your effectiveness and hopefully be inspired by what they have to say. Go out into the world, make a difference, leave a legacy, build your own success story, and maybe then you'll come back onto Mediator Academy and share your story with my audience. All right, the big question for today's interview is this. When we're talking to potential users of mediation, espousing all its benefits, are we really painting an inviting, attractive picture of mediation? One that would lead someone to spontaneously and voluntarily choose to mediate? Or are our words and actions unwittingly turning people off the idea of mediation? I can say with confidence that my guest today is an expert in this field. She's a professor of social interaction at Loughborough University and Associate Dean for Research for the School of Social, Political, Geographical Sciences. Her research interests are in social interaction, conversation analysis and membership categorization analysis of interaction in a variety of contexts, including police interrogation, community and family mediation, dating, education, and communication training. I'm definitely going to come back to dating a little bit later in the interview. Some of her research underpins the conversation analytic role-play method, which is a technique she has developed for communication training, which is helping mediators increase the uptake of mediation and improve the quality of the conversations they have with potential users and parties in mediation. She teaches on the BSC Social Psychology Program and was nominated by students for Lecturer of the Year in 2013. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Elizabeth Stokoe onto Mediate Academy. Welcome,
Hi,
Elizabeth.
Hi.
And I should say you are a professor at Loughborough, the greatest university on the planet.
Absolutely.
And I say that without any prejudice. Liz, thank you for doing this. We met, it must have been either sometime this year, last year, I can't remember, but you came and did a talk at Ealing Community Mediation Service, which is a service that I'm a volunteer with. And you talked about how mediators, when they take calls or office managers or intake managers, when they receive telephone calls from potential users of mediation, there are things that they say and do during the course of those conversations that could either turn parties off mediation or increase participation in mediation. And I have to say that the light bulbs went on all over the place. I'm really interested in that kind of work. Tell me a bit more about that work, and specifically, how can it help mediators generally, but increasing participation in mediation?
Well, it's an interesting one to focus on intake calls to mediation services, because it's a place where most people never really think about looking to research or train for mediation. The whole thing came about in a way by accident, because about 15 years ago I was interested in neighbour relationships and disputes, and that was my interest, and I wanted to try and capture neighbour relationships in flight, if you like, live, not interfered with by a researcher. And so I had mediation services record their incoming calls, and I was also interested in getting recordings of mediation itself. But services were quite reluctant to do that, although I actually did end up with some mediation. And the recording of calls was a bit of a sop to me, like, well, have the calls. That's where people first explain their neighbour problem, and the data were brilliant for my study of neighbour disputes. But in a way, it was telling that these calls were seen as not necessarily that important. And we know from where the research focus is, it's all on mediation rather than intake calls. And to the best of my knowledge, I'm the only person who has studied intake calls and then developed training for that as well. But of course, if you don't get those calls right, then you don't convert enough callers into clients, and then the service doesn't work. So if you don't get people into mediation to do the amazing work of mediation, then your service is going to fail. And so what I did was I started to notice, when I was looking at what callers were saying about neighbours, I started to focus more and more on what was happening with what the mediators were doing. And noticing that in the hundreds of calls that I'd collected across different services, that a large proportion of them were ending up with no client. And so I started to ask, well, can I see places in these calls, if you think of them as a bit like a racetrack, you sort of start off and you want to be with your participant, and you sort of go along the racetrack together and hopefully sort of running the same race and ending up in the same place together. And there are projects along the way. And what I was noticing was that some of these projects were not successfully executed. It was like the mediator didn't really know their racetrack. They didn't know the hurdles that were going to come along and sort of smack them in the face and cause the caller to be out of the race, to just sort of end there and say, no, I'm not interested in mediation. So that's how it all came about. And there are a variety of things that I found by studying those calls that are a real turn-off to callers, or things that mediators do, perhaps where you can see the logic of why they're asking this particular question, but in fact it leads them down a rather tricky pathway to come back from and try and rescue the call, and mediators often fail to do that.
I mean, it's very interesting. In civil and commercial mediation in the UK, there's also a real frustration because parties are not choosing mediation. There isn't a volume of cases coming through, and so I think this stuff is useful for community mediation services, definitely. But also, I'm just thinking about the conversations we have in general about mediation. I mean, if I talk to a man in the street or anyone about what I do, so they say, oh, mediation. Once I get over, no, it's not meditation. Once I get over that bit, then I say, so what is it? Well, first of all, the great thing about it is I'm impartial. So, I don't judge. I'm not here to judge. I'll listen to you and your... And that's what, and that's not just me as well. Lots of other mediators. So tell me what you discovered in your research.
Well, you have to sort of think about, why is it that people are phoning a mediation service, whether it be community or family, which I'm recording now and sort of hoping to sort of start to learn more about the family mediation racetrack as well. People are phoning normally at a point where they've really reached the end of their tether. They've tried a whole bunch of other things, and typically they've tried to get somebody to be on their side, to be their advocate. So community mediators phone environmental health or the police or the council, where they want someone to come and act on their behalf and constrain the behaviour of the other party, who is 100% in the wrong, while the caller is 100% in the right. So callers to both community and family services typically have a one-sided problem, which is, I'm lovely and they're awful. And what mediators are trying to sell is a two-sided solution. They're also trying to sell a solution based in talk. And one of the things that is a problem is that mediators will ask callers in community calls, perhaps not so much in family, but have you tried talking to your neighbour? Now, the answer to that question has to be, well, it can't be, talking. I hadn't thought about that. Thanks very much. Bye. It has to be something about why it is that you can't talk to the neighbour. Callers will take every opportunity to negatively characterise the other party in pursuit of the person who they're talking to being on their side. And so what typically happens, one of the first things that I noticed with a colleague of mine, Derek Edwards, was that mediators would very often ask this question, have you tried talking to your neighbour? The answer would always be extremely negative and about how the other person is the kind of person you can't talk to. And then mediators would start explaining mediation as a talk-based solution. And it causes a real crash in the call. And it's a bit like going to the doctors with a headache and telling the doctor that you've tried paracetamol and that didn't work, and you've tried all the things that you can do for yourself, and that's why you're going to an expert. And then the doctor says, let me tell you a bit about paracetamol and how that can help. So callers will say, I've tried talking and it hasn't worked, because they're the kind of person you can't talk to because they're awful and I'm not. Yeah. And it's a bit like, the mediators then come back and say, let me tell you about talking and how that can help.
Yeah.
So that's one dangerous question that can lead you down into dangerous territory.
Yeah.
But because callers are in the position of having to tell you how awful their neighbour is, generated by the question that the mediator asks.
Yes.
So and then right next to that, the mediator starts explaining mediation.
I guess there's an implicit assumption then on the part of the mediator that the callers are, fully informed about what mediation is and why they're calling and what
exactly.
can help.
And they're very often not. And in fact, again, looking at all of these calls, they typically start with, I've just been given your number by somebody else. The somebody else will tell you the kind of thing that they think is going to help them. So if it's Citizens Advice Bureau or the police, then they want a legal solution to their problem.
Yes.
What doesn't happen is that people phone up and say, hello, mediation, I know all about you. I know you have an 80% success rate and I would like mediation, please.
Yes.
They just don't start that way. They start with their kind of, they start by displaying, I don't know what you do.
Yes.
And so mediators are in the position of having to sell an unknown service. It's not a culturally familiar thing.
Yes.
It's not like we know if we have a serious injury, there's hospital, we've got a child that needs educating, we know about school, but we have these disputes and people don't know about mediation.
Yes.
So mediation's already on the back foot. And then what they're trying to do is sell a two-handed, even-handed service to somebody who really just wants someone to be on their side.
Yes. And when you were studying these calls, did you have an idea of what proportion of calls were resulting in mediations and rejections of mediation?
About 2/3 saying no. So quite a lot of people saying no in cases where you could sort of see this could be mediatable.
Yeah.
But of course, what I'm after as a conversation analyst is not really finding out, all the things that mediators do badly, but in fact to find out from within what people do in their workplaces, whether it be mediation or anything else, what works.
Yes.
Because the answer to the problem is always going to be in somebody doing their job really well. And, plenty of mediators are managing to convert skeptical callers to mediation and saying yes to meeting the mediators. And so my training, not only does it sort of show cases where things sort of go wrong and get people to reflect on why it is before I sort of show them why it is, but also get them to see what works, what's effective.
So, well, before we come on to what are the things that work, I also want to explore what are the other sort of barriers that mediators unwittingly put up that lead people to withdraw or reject mediation. Yeah. But I'm really fascinated by the kind of conversation analysis. Could you just say a little bit more about that as a science, as a practice?
Conversation analysts, of which there are many world-leading ones at Loughborough, which is part of the reason I'm here as well. It's a nice community of people all doing similar kind of work. What we do is we try to understand interaction scientifically. Okay. And a lot of people think that, well, I talk all the time, so I know how talk works. But it's a bit like thinking, well, we all know how to walk, but typically we don't know the machinery that connects our brain, our skeleton, and our musculature to make walking happen or running or whatever. Right. And talk is a bit the same, that we all know how to talk, but we don't necessarily understand the machinery of social interaction. Right. And that's what conversation analysis is about. And so people typically have a sort of stereotypical idea of interaction or a very normative sense of things like what body language is or what silence is. And conversation analysts through, it's a 50-year history of research, have shown how systematic interaction is. It's not the messy thing that people also sometimes think it is. And so what we do is we record multiple examples of a particular type of encounter, whether that be mediators and clients or doctors and patients or friends or people on a date, which we can come back to later, and then sort of think about it again. I think the racetrack metaphor is useful because you can get a sense of along the obstacle course or the racetrack, you've got projects to be accomplished, and so within any telephone call, there's going to be an opening, there's going to be a reason for the call, there's going to be the substance of the call, and a pre-closing and then a closing. Right. So you can sort of see an overall organisation, and then you can sort of dig into particular projects along the way. So in so in terms of the mediation telephone calls, what I do is transcribe them in a very technical way,
Right.
because we're looking at talk in a very forensic way, focused very much on intonation and pacing and so on. And one of the projects on that call is going to be the mediator explaining mediation.
Okay.
And there's various things that are interesting about that. One of them is that no one's born learning how to explain mediation. So there's no kind of, it's not that people do it naturally better or not.
Yes.
That services and mediators have their way of explaining mediation that they typically use.
Yes.
But conversations, these calls are a little bit like natural experiments in that you can see this type of explanation, and they typically coalesce in two kinds of ways. And then you can see how does the caller respond to that? And you can sort of see the outcome right within the context of the call. Was it effective? Did it immediately hook the caller, or can you see the caller starting to disengage? So these conversations are a little bit like little natural experiments that are there in the world.
Yeah.
One thing, just as an aside, that I'm also doing with a colleague at Loughborough, Fred Attenborough, is that we're using these little natural experiments of things like explanations of mediation, seeing what works and what doesn't work, and then thinking about, well, let's have a look at the explanations of mediation online or on leaflets. Are they ticking the same boxes, or have they got the same, there's one of those things that doesn't work, and we can see that it doesn't work because we've got the evidence from our little natural experiments in the telephone calls.
I mean, I did a talk last week about increasing participation in mediation, and there was there's been a huge emphasis on, or there's a belief that if parties were better informed, if parties, judges, lawyers were better informed about mediation, that there would be an uptake in mediation. So that's the kind of assumption.
Yeah.
And Lord Justice Jackson's review of civil litigation costs, I think, he talks about how the fragmentation of information, and says there needs to be a single authoritative guide on mediation that should be on the desk of every judge and every lawyer. And this book has been written, and when you read the section on mediation, it's very interesting. I'm reading it, I'm thinking, and I'm also reading your papers, and I'm thinking, oh, why didn't they speak to Liz before they wrote this book? Because again, it's kind of information written down, and all sorts of meanings will be inferred, and then how does the judge then take that information that's written down and then describe it to someone? Oh, it's just...
Yeah, I mean, I think it's right that the more mediation is seen as the go-to service for disputes of all kinds in our culture, like we know, like I said, we've got children need educating. Oh, what are we going to do? Where do we go for that? Oh, school. It's just like an automatic fit.
Yeah.
If you can get to an automatic fit between a relationship dispute of what, in whatever context, to mediation, then that's got to be a good thing.
Yes.
But obviously you want to make the service attractive to people, so that they see the value added. I think a lot of explanations of mediation, they say all the things that mediation is not. So in fact, I'm going to the Ministry of Justice next week to partly talk about the advert that they've got for family mediation.
Right.
And it has this series of questions, which is, is mediation this? No. Is mediation this? No. Does it do this? No. Rather than saying what it is, I mean, and it does say what it is, but not in a. But it doesn't sort of do it in a. It's an if-then question answer. The structure is wrong. And then you'll see mediation explanations where it says, mediation can be quite helpful, or mediation can work if this happens and that happens, rather than mediation works well because this is what mediators do.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of sort of hesitancy around explanations. No one wants to say mediation works. It's like, well, it can work.
Yeah, I mean, to use your sort of racetrack analogy, it's as if they're deliberately building obstacles of Beecher's Brook proportion. When it isn't necessary, they could, it could be a straight. What do they call those?
Yes, I know what you mean. I don't know what they're called.
Yeah, why do they do it?
Well, I'm sure it's explanations are done with the best of intentions, but the problem is that mediators know what they do, but your average person really doesn't know what mediation is. And typically, that, like I say, they don't want they want an even-handed service. They want someone to really see you're lovely, and your dispute other is the guilty party. And in a way, just sort of psychologically, you can see that this is the case in for human beings. In a way, we sort of want to be right, and it's difficult to compromise and move. But what I've also found is that in these explanations of mediation, when people phone up and they basically give you a whole load of reasons why this is a one-sided dispute. They'll say things like, this isn't one of those where it's a bit of one and half a dozen of the other. They'll sort of tell you the things that this is not one of those. This isn't about, a bit of noise late at night. It's not one of those. And everyone knows this person's wrong. And so they really work hard to undermine that sense of, don't be even-handed. This isn't one of those. Yes. But mediators will typically explain mediation as something. So they'll explain their impartiality in terms of, we don't take sides, we don't judge events, and we listen to your version of events, or we listen to your story. Yeah. People are okay with listening to my story, but when the other side's story or side is introduced, and it's those specific words, sides, points of view, versions, that seem to be the things that you can then start to sort of see within tenths of a second that the caller stops aligning with the mediator's explanation.
When you say aligning, what do you mean?
Well, the mediator at this point on the call has got a project to explain mediation. Yes. And when you just did a yes. So my project right now is to explain mediate this thing, and you did a yes in the right place. And you just did another one. Now, what you see in the calls is that the callers will say yes, like you just did, to certain things, certain ingredient features, component features of the call, and then they stop doing yes to other bits. And the other bits are so they're happy with being talked to themselves, but they're not. They stop aligning, stop doing yes, and they start saying things like, "Is there anything else that I can do? Is there anything else that I can call? Because I really don't think that's going to work." Because they're the kind of person you can't talk to once the notion that the other side will be listened to equally. Now, you're probably thinking, well, okay, those things don't work. So what does work? And what I found does work is a procedural explanation, a process-oriented explanation of mediation, which does not hide the fact that the mediator is going to talk to the other party, but they don't talk in terms of sides, versions, partiality. Okay. They just say, to put it very bluntly, we try to help people do this. Mediation is a positive thing. It's not. They don't talk about, we don't have any authority, we don't have any power, and we can't do this, we don't do that. So they don't have that in it. That's one thing. They don't talk about sides and versions and points of view. They just say, we'll arrange to meet you, and then we'll offer the same appointment to your neighbour or partner. And they just talk about it in a process way. So there's no hiding that the other party will be heard by the mediator. Yes. But it's those little words, sides, versions, points of view, that seem to be real triggers for people to suddenly think, okay, sides, well, I want someone on my side.
Yes.
So, and this seems to hold across community and family so far, in terms of what I've seen.
And of course, when you're analysing, you can see, every sort of pause, every, stutter.
Every in-breath, every stutter, yeah.
And then I'm assuming that you have a kind of a body of data to suggest what those, the meaning of those pauses.
Yes, you can start to sort of see, for example, a mediator will explain, we don't take sides, we don't judge events, we just try to, facilitate a conversation between you or something, to a person who's just told you they want to talk to their neighbour, having been asked the question, have you tried talking to your neighbour? So that's one bad thing. Yeah. And then, so this will sort of roll out. So in the workshops, what I do is I play the transcript in time with the audio so that people can live through the call live, and you see the mediator saying, and the words come at the same time, we don't take sides, we don't judge events, we just facilitate conversation. And then there's a silence, and it's a bit like a tumbleweed sort of going across, and it's 2.5 seconds, which might not sound very long, but once you start to understand that, between two turns at talk, you might get a beat of silent, a beat which is like a tenth of a second or something. Yeah. 2.5 seconds is an age, and you can really feel it. You can really hear that painful, and then the person says, well, I don't really think they'd cooperate. And then the mediator says, no. and they haven't got a resource for handling what is a very common reason for people saying no to mediation, which is they're the kind of person who won't. So it's like mediators don't know their racetrack. They don't know that an explanation about sides and versions is going to be off-putting.
Yeah.
And they don't know that number one reason how people will get out of mediation is by saying they're the kind of person who won't. If you're not ready for that,
Yes.
then the end of the call is nigh.
Yeah. So what have you learned then about an effective way of handling that sort of objection?
This is like a magic bullet to that kind of objection. And again, I found it from what mediators do.
Yes.
So what mediators who are faced with that they're the kind of person who won't,
Yes.
is they'll basically propose that the caller is the kind of person who will. And of course, the caller has spent 5 minutes telling you how nice they are by implication. So mediators who say something like, but you'd be willing to see two of our mediators just to talk about it all. Oh, of course, yeah. I was always gonna say yes. And I found that you'd be willing, or would you be willing, as a kind of thing, a follow on from they're the kind of person who won't. Conversation isn't a click behavioristic kind of thing, a deterministic kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it's not good. These things don't work every time. But what you're after is a tilt towards an outcome that is favourable, and being willing and asking directly if someone's willing, bearing in mind that it's quite hard to say that you're not when you've tried to sort of push all the way through, I'm a reasonable, nice person. You can see how that works.
Yeah.
And it does.
So you talked about aligning. Effectively, is the mediator then aligning with the party by saying, and you're the kind of person that would you be willing to? Is that?
I mean, I wouldn't call it alignment in a technical conversation analytic way,
Okay.
but obviously what you're seeing is the mediator using their experience in a way. They can sort of see that what the most common objection to mediation is, which is the other person won't.
Yes.
And they use that to propose to the caller that they're the kind of person who will. And of course, if you say that to both parties, whether they be the initiator or the person who's,
Yes.
on the back foot, the person being complained about or something like that, party two, you can ask them both if they're willing, because, from their point of view, they're not party one and party two.
Yeah.
They're both right, and the other person is wrong. So from their point of view, they are both the right party, and the other party is going to be the one who won't.
Yeah.
So it works for both.
That is just amazing, isn't it? Just to be able to do that and kind of locate those moments in the conversation where, you reach a junction effectively and go, look, this could go either way.
Yeah.
And to recognise that the mediator can influence that direction.
Yeah, absolutely.
By how they respond.
And I think one thing that's quite important about working this way, starting sort of bottom up and looking at people doing their jobs, which is, underpins the training approach in a way, is if you were to develop training on handling intake calls,
Yeah.
and you hadn't seen this research, what would you choose as your trainables? Where would you focus your attention?
Yeah.
My guess is that people would not pick the right things to train people handling those initial calls for.
Definitely not.
Because and that's not because they're not experts at actually maybe doing those calls,
Yeah.
but it's very hard to sort of reflect on what you do and know it in the way a conversation analyst can know it. So at the very least, what one thing that the research can do is find the trainable things, find the things to watch out for on your racetrack. Know your racetrack, and if you don't know what's coming, then you're not going to be able to handle it. So know it and know what works in these conversations.
And this isn't just intake calls, because I did a presentation last week at a mediation symposium, room full of lawyers, commercial mediators, and I asked them to tell me what are the kinds of things they would say to parties or lawyers if they were talking about mediation. What words would they use? And I wrote them all up on the flip charts, and then I presented your work, and I said, okay, so here's a body of evidence that suggests that these are the kinds of things that can turn people off. And we looked through the list, and you could see people going, oh my goodness, no wonder and people came up to me at the end of this and said, I had some major light bulb moments going on there, because the way I'm describing mediation, if I listen to myself, it just sounds really negative. Who'd want to come and sit in a room with me?
Yeah, I mean, you do sort of see some some ways that mediation is explained, that when I'm presenting them to mediators in a workshop, their jaws drop a bit as well. And you can you can see them thinking, why would anyone ever say it? So, things like, we have a fairly limited role. We can be quite helpful. Why would you characterize the service in that way? Why not say, we're very successful, we're very experienced, push all the positives. So one thing I find myself saying a lot to mediators is, be assertive. Don't say it can work if this happens. Say it works because of this. Yeah. This is the value added. This is what mediation brings to the party. Yeah. Because people are, like I say, people have tried something which is talking to the party. They might have tried it for years, and they're now asking for intervention, like anyone does when they're asking for an expert to help in their lives. And so, mediators really have to say what it is that they can do that is more than just facilitating a conversation that people have been trying to have for years.
Yes, yeah.
Especially if they're paying for it.
Indeed, yeah. I thought the sort of the drawers dropping analogy segues nicely into the dating. I don't want to spend any time on that, other than I'm just out of curiosity. What are the kinds of things that you discover when you analyse dating conversations or those sorts of interactions?
This was a project that might have gone further, except that I sort of lost interest a little bit in the data. Actually, you might not think. Well, you might wonder, in a way, how can mediation data sustain 10 years of work, but dating only in the end sustains one article? But that's just the way it is. And these were people on a speed date, so it was nice because there were these 5-minute interactions where people were getting to know each other. And typically, psychologists, when studying sort of a lot of social life actually, but dating as well, what they do is they get people in a room, simulate having a conversation, and they'll watch from behind an observation screen, or they'll let people to report on a questionnaire what happens in a date, rather than studying the sort of analytic, the actual black box, the actual date itself. Let's find out how that works, because that can be so productive. So I was looking at these dates, and they were collected by a master's student of mine a number of years ago who had a contact who ran a speed dating organisation. And I mean, I focused in the end on the way people talked about each other's relationship histories. Okay. And it was interesting. This was a group of people who were 30 to 45 age group. So you might expect by that kind of age that people will have had some relationships in the past. And so I looked at who asked questions about relationship histories and what kinds of relationship histories were attractive to others or not. Okay. And basically the finding was that women ask questions about men's relationship histories, perhaps a bit more than men ask women. Mm-hmm. And also that men will offer relationship histories that they clearly think is going to sound attractive, otherwise they perhaps wouldn't be explaining it this way, where they'll say things like, never been married, no, I've got no baggage, and they might think that sounds like a sell. But to the woman, that's a bit of a suspicious why. Mm-hmm. So basically what I found was that the successful relationship history for a man of a certain age is to say that he's been in committed relationships in the past. It's okay not to be married, but demonstrate evidence of commitment. Yeah. It didn't work the other way around, though, in that men weren't interested in women's relationship histories. They didn't necessarily ask, and a woman who'd been single for however much, this wasn't an obstacle to future relationships for men.
Okay. Very interesting.
So if you're a man on a date, you might want to ramp up the commitment that you've had in the past. That will tick more boxes.
God, I've got more baggage than you could possibly imagine. Okay, all right. I can see how the research didn't sort of sustain itself. So Liz, I know you do a lot of training, a lot of workshops, and by the way, if you're a mediator running a service, watching this interview now, I can vouch for Liz's work because I've read a lot about it. I've seen her in action, and this stuff is, we're talking about empirical data now. This isn't kind of a theory that you've kind of, it sort of works for me, so it should work for everyone else. This is really robust stuff. So I'll come on to towards the end of the interview how they can find more a bit about the workshops that you run, but please consider this. This is really, really interesting stuff. And I think it can massively increase participation. And if we give the right information out to parties, how do we create an impression that mediation is wonderful? Because it is. It can really make a difference, but we need to get better at selling it. All right, that's enough selling from me. So, Liz, one of the workshops that you run focuses on opening a mediation. Am I right?
That's correct. That's one of them. Yeah.
Okay. So, tell me what I should do to what would be an effective opening for a mediation. What have you discovered? What's less effective? And yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So these are workshops that run looking at actual mediation now. So the data that I collected, which looks at mediators now with clients. So the phone calls happened and now they've got the client. And there's a number of things that you can watch out for in these openings. So we're really looking at the moments where mediators explain what's going to happen today, leading up to the point where they ask the question of the client or clients to sort of summarize the problem or something like that. So that's what we're looking at, and we're looking at really minutes or maybe sometimes seconds, but we're not looking at a very long stretch of talk. But there are moments in there, there are things happening in there where you can really take an opportunity to frame participation and also things to watch out for with regards to socializing your participants into what's going to happen.
Okay.
So one thing is that this is a place where mediators will explain what mediation is again. So all the usual pitfalls and to watch out for, explain mediation as something where don't start talking about not taking sides and so on, and that we can have a limited role. So you want to, again, sort of, if you're going to explain mediation, do it in a process-oriented way. Yeah. Keep it simple. Then, so there's that. In the midst of that explanation, you might want to be thinking about the participation of the client or clients. Mm-hmm. So if you've got more than one client in the room, you've got both parties, what can often happen in these openings is that one party will be something like what I call a pitcher. So they will take every opportunity to jump in and say, oh yes, Alid, yes, I understand, yes. And the other person might not be also doing that. Now, if there are two mediators in the room and one person is doing the explanation, the ground rules, and you've got this picture, then the other mediator really needs to watch out and invite the other party. And is that okay with you as well, party two? So that you're socializing the pitcher who's doing I'm very keen and enthusiastic into what's going to happen, which is you're not going to be allowed to just speak like that such that the other person doesn't have an opportunity. Right. So I think this is quite important, and I think then it's consequential for who you ask to go first. So you've got the how do you explain mediation? Yeah. You've got watching out for pitches and ensuring that you teach in a way teach by showing. So show party one who's kind of pitching away that's not going to happen, and that party two is going to be asked for their opinion equally all the way through the mediation. Yeah. Then you've got the transition from doing all that explanation to asking the question. So tell me what's been happening with you. Yeah. That's an opportunity for you to frame things like, so it's really great that you're here, and I know you want to have a much better relationship with your neighbour, work colleague, whoever it is. Yes. Mediator is in control, so they can do anything in that slot. Yeah. They can do really positive things in that slot. Yeah. And it's a bit like, would you be willing? Proposing that you're here and so that's great, and that means that I know that you really want to get this relationship on a better footing. Yeah. People aren't really going to say no to that. Yeah. So it's a good way to sort of transition into the mediation. Right. Tells them a bit, and again, socialises them as to this is what we're doing here. We're aiming for improvement at the end. Uh-huh. And when you've got both parties in the room, to sort of watch out for equal treatment right from the start. So not just that one person's going to talk and then the other person, but if you've got somebody coming in all the time when you're explaining what's going to happen today, then you need to watch out right from the start about that impartiality as a sort of educational introduction to mediation.
Okay, so I mean, it's interesting. Earlier on today, I did an interview. We talk about family mediators. I interviewed Lisa Parkinson earlier today, and I mean, Lisa is she started a mediation practice when I was still in nappies, right? In the 70s, and she was talking about the importance of intervening quickly.
Yes.
and also early on. So echoing what you're saying really, and she's just doing that based on her 40 years experience of mediating. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
So intervening quickly.
Yes.
Anything else that is important for us to know when we're opening a mediation, or anything that is a definite no?
I think it's just important to use those opportunities to explain mediation positively and clearly, and not overly long, not in an overly lengthy way.
Okay.
If you've got sort of ground rules about confidentiality and so on to explain, then it's worth sort of saying these are the things that we explain to everybody, rather than sort of just try and remember a script, and that they can be a little bit stodgy and clunky, those openings where people are sort of clearly trying to get all the right things in. It's probably better to just say, here's all the things, and have a bit of paper and say, this is the rules of mediation, and we're just going to go through these very quickly, check you understand, and move on, do it in that kind of way. And like I said, I think watching both clients participating equally in those openings is important too.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting as you're saying this now. I'm thinking to myself, I think I talk too much at the start of a mediation.
Possibly people might not be hearing that because they're just dying to talk.
Yeah, so after probably about a minute, they're probably thinking, "Wish this guy would shut up. I just want to get cracking."
Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
Okay, so that's helpful. I'll hopefully invite my co-mediator to give me some feedback on that.
Yeah.
And just finally, then, solution-focused questions. That's another workshop that you run. Just could you say a little bit more about that and give an example of a solution-focused question and the benefits of it?
Okay, just very briefly.
Yeah.
I was given solution-focused sort of training manual by a mediation service who asked me to see if I could find those in action, if you like, in the data.
Yeah.
And I actually struggled to find the questions as written in mediation, but I looked at sort of future-oriented questions.
Okay.
And tried to sort of understand their trajectory.
Yeah.
And one of the things that was interesting in a way was when are they used and are they cashed in? So if you invest in one of these questions, does it take you down the trajectory you think it's going to, which is towards a solution?
Yeah.
And can you then sort of cash it in and follow it up in a useful, productive way?
Yeah.
And I think I'll just leave it and say ... because these things don't quite unfold in the way that you might imagine.
Yeah. And I was asking about solution-focused questioning because, again, in my interview earlier with Lisa was told a story about a barrister that asked a woman, I'm not sure if this is a solution-focused question, by the way, but he said something like, if your daughter's a couple of years old now, if you were to fast forward when she's 16 years old, what would you say to her that... what reasons would you give as to why you wouldn't let her see her father? I don't think that's a solution-focused question, is it?
It's a kind of hypothetical, future-oriented question.
Future-oriented. That was the.
Yeah.
And the response was, I didn't see my father when I was growing up, and that led on to a really productive conversation. So I mean, there was a really good example of a future-oriented question and the benefits of it.
Yeah.
Liz, look, I know you're on a tight schedule. You've got a dash. I really, really appreciate you giving your time
it's nice to talk about it. So thanks so much for inviting me.
And if someone's watching this now, and I know there will be people watching this that will want to get in touch, find out more about what you do, at the very least, reach out to you and say thank you. What's the best way for them to do that?
The best way is to just Google, and you'll come straight to my website.
Okay.
So if you just Google Elizabeth Stokoe Loughborough, you'll come straight to me.
Okay. Shall I put the link to the website underneath the interview? Would that help?
That'd be great. I do have a Calm training website, which is www.calmtraining.org.
Okay.
But the link, you'll find that as well just by Googling. Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Liz, I want to be the first to say thank you. Thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate it. And have a wonderful day.
Thanks very much for inviting me.
Thanks, Liz.
Okay.
Okay. Bye.